There's our bell this morning. Begin our Bible class. Got several who are, I'm sure, coming in. Glad for your presence today. Before we begin, though, let's have a word of prayer, and then we'll get started with our class today. Father, we're thankful for the day, for our blessings, for the time that we have allotted to study more in depth your word. We pray that you would bless our time today. Bless each of us that is here, or those that are watching online as well. Bless us in all we do for you. It's in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, chapter 6, 1 Corinthians chapter 6. We've called this, or I've called this, the Christian responses. He deals mainly with what we began talking about on last Sunday, and that, of course, is the taking others to court, that sort of thing. But he is going to get into something else as well, and so hopefully you'll see by the end of it why I've labeled it such. Last Sunday, we dealt primarily with the introduction to chapter 6. We kind of went over the Greek law at the time, hopefully to understand why Paul is giving them the admonitions that he is. And so hopefully that will be of help to you. If you need to, I think it's still available. You can watch that online and kind of get the ideas there. Because while our law system, our courts are based on Greek and Roman courts and laws, there are certainly some differences that were there, and some of those differences are what are important to notice for chapter 6, and that's what we talked about the last time that we were together. We'll look at some of those points here just at the end. Remember, or if you weren't here, these will kind of a little bit of review, because what he's going to get into is not necessarily exactly what they're doing, but it's the why that's the problem. I had several people last week come out and ask about, should we use the courts? Should we, use the law, that sort of thing? And I said, just, hold still or hold tight. We're going to get to there and we'll talk more about it. But what the people here were doing they were doing what everybody else was doing, and that is taking each other to court for, in many ways, reasons that really didn't matter. And the certain principles that were being broken here is why Paul was writing to them. According to the law and the courts at the time, anyone could take anyone to court for any reason. And if you didn't get a certain number of the jurors who voted for you, you could be penalized and not allowed to bring any suits for a time. And so there was, a little penalty that was involved. But mainly it was something that just about anybody could do, especially citizens at the time. Now these cases, court cases here took place in, at the very best, a semi-public forum where you had a number of people. The jurors could number anywhere between 200 and 1,000 people who were listening to this court case. And so they would take with them not only the merits of the case, but they would also take with it who it was that was doing the arguing and what the problem was. Because you had to argue yourself. There were no lawyers that you could use that would speak for you. You had to speak for yourself. And so these claimants and these defendants, whatever the problems were that they were having, instead of dealing with it like Christians were supposed to, they were taking it and airing it out in front of everybody, where you could have upwards of 1,000 people who were listening, didn't know the backgrounds really, didn't know what the church was. This was probably the first time they had heard of Jesus or what Christians were like. And if this was the first taste that they got of what Christianity was, many of them would have been turned off. And so this gets into really Paul's overall point that he's making here. It's not that they were using the court system. It's, number one, why they were doing it, and number two, what it was doing to their influence. And so we'll talk more about that. Certainly I'm getting ahead of myself. But just the points to remember before we continue on with this. We did get to verse 4 and 5. We read verse 4 in the King James, and I said that it needed a little help because in verse 4, in the King James, it's a statement, and it works much better as a question. Keep in mind, in Greek and certainly ancient languages like that, punctuation didn't exist. In certain languages, Greek included, there weren't spaces even. They were just, it was long lines here of text in certain transcriptions. And so here in verse 4, it really needs the question that's there. New American Standard reads that for us as well. If any have law courts dealing with matters of this life, why then do you appoint them as judges who are of no account to the church? And this is the point that Paul is wanting to make to them. They were going before people who really, not that they didn't have any business deciding these things, but they had no background information that would help them to determine this. The church at Corinth, according to what Paul seems to be saying there, thought that they were so smart and so wise, and yet they needed the world to approve of certain cases or decide matters between them. If you have law courts dealing with matters of this life, do you appoint them as judges who have no account in the church? You too, Christians, the two of you who were going to court here, in part because of the entertainment value that it provided for others, and you are, and I keep using this phrase, but airing dirty laundry before the whole world, in essence here. Why are you doing that? We have courts that deal with the problems of this life, and there certainly he's not saying we shouldn't use that, but then you have some kind of matter that could be dealt with privately, and yet you'd rather jump all of the steps in order to get to the point where you're telling everybody about it. Very similar, we've mentioned before, if you watch the court cases on TV or something like that, and you see that, you don't know anything about those two people that are there other than what one is saying about the other, and neither of them have a really good attitude about the other one. And so how can we do this? How can we go and before the world in these court cases that Paul's dealing with, having the love of Jesus that I'm supposed to have for someone? If I'm following his example, I'm not going to be doing this, at least in the way that they were. So that's the idea here of the question, because of his seems to be his attitude towards them in verses 2 and 3, in that he was. They seem to think that they were going to judge the world and angels in the end. Seems to be what he's saying there. If that's going to be the case, Paul's using their words against them. If you think you're going to be judging angels at the end of the world, why can't you judge a small matter between brethren right now? Okay, so see, he's trying to get them to see they're becoming superfluous in their agitation one towards another. You and I have a disagreement. Well, what does everybody else do? Well, they take each other to court. Well, we're going to continue to do that. Christians are supposed to be different. Their minds are changed through repentance, and they look at things differently. The problem in Corinth was that they were acting just like the world, and that gets more to the point here. It's not that we can't do the things that the world does. You know, we drive vehicles, and we go to school, and we go to work with the world. It's not that we can't be like the world in certain respects. But when it comes to things, what Paul is mentioning here, there was no difference between your average Corinthian and the Corinthian Christian, member of the church there. There was no distinction. There was no line that could be drawn. And so because of these things, he has to mention their own belief or their own ideas about how they can judge this or that. And yet, when it comes to the small matters, they need help from the world. And this seems to be the problem that he's dealing with there. You, the Corinthians here, those of you who thought so highly of yourselves that in one point earlier in the letter, Paul said, you're strong and we're weak. You're intelligent and smart and wise and we're foolish. You know, kind of in that sarcastic way. He said, those of you who thought so highly of yourselves that you are going to judge men and angels at the second coming. Why did you would never let an ignorant member decide spiritual matters? And yet you're taking each other to court. People who don't know any better are deciding matters here. And this is the first, and in certain cases, the only idea that certain people would have about the church. It's what they saw in those public forums. Why are you going outside of the church to settle matters with people who are ignorant of what's actually been happening and are unlearned in certain respects? Think back, perhaps you remember several years ago, the Winkler trial there, Mary Winkler, who had killed her husband, and he was a preacher in the church, Dan Winkler's son. And think back, if you can remember, I remember it pretty vividly because of what happens afterwards. You have the news, the news agencies and everybody else every night would have something about this trial, something that captivated a large part of the nation. And it evolved to the point where they started to delve into, well, what is the Church of Christ? And they had these people come on that weren't even members of the church who they were interviewing. Tell us more about this group. And that word cult was used a lot during that time. And certainly, and they would pick and choose different things that had happened or other people that are not the best examples. And on it went. And you're just sitting there thinking, this is not right. But yet that was, in certain cases, that was the first and maybe even only indication of what people had about the Church of Christ in certain respects. And so while it wasn't a fair view and certainly wasn't handled in the right way, and there were far more important matters that had transpired than that, that kind of gives you the idea there of what was happening here. People just show up to the court just to be entertained by the speeches that day, and they hear two people who believe in Jesus, claim to love each other like Jesus does, and yet are saying all kinds of things about each other. It wasn't that they were using the court system, it's how they were doing it, and probably more importantly, why they were doing it. That was the big problem. And so why would you do this? If you can think you judge all kinds of other things, why not the small matters that you have here between brethren? That might get us to verse 5 and 6. There anything else, though, up to verse 4, maybe a review from last time? All right, he says, let's do verses 5 and 6. We'll get both of them together there. I speak to your shame. Is it so that there is not a wise man among you? No, not one that shall be able to judge between his brethren. I speak this up to this point to your shame. He wants them to understand what they've done. They've made a spectacle, the wrong kind of spectacle, of the church and Christian love specifically. And so he wants them to, as he did in chapter 5 with the one who was living in adultery, he's speaking to their shame. He wants them to change. And so he asked them the question, is there not a wise man among you? This church that thought so highly of itself, and thought so much of itself that it was so loving that even someone who was living in sin, they wouldn't ask to change. They thought of themselves as so loving. They thought of themselves as so wise and judicious, and yet there's not a wise person there that can handle a small matter between brethren. We're not talking about, again, the different kinds of courts in the Greek system. We're not talking about criminal courts or murder cases or things like that. This seems to be a civil case of small matter. You know, I kept using the number, $50 or something like that. Something that was insignificant in the long run. They were making a huge deal about it. Paul said, you don't have a wise person there that can fix this? And in certain cases, he was even, he's talking to a church here who would have the miraculous ability. One of the 9 spiritual gifts is the miraculous ability of knowledge, to know miraculously what's right and what's wrong, what's true and what's false, what's good and what's evil. And yet they weren't even using that gift. They would rather go before the world, really, and put on a show and show what Christ is not than to do the right thing. So he says here, I speak to your shame. I speak to your shame. Paul is trying to move them in order to change. He wants them to be shameful of what they've done because they are a reflection. They're merely a light of what Jesus is. Jesus said, that we should behave in such a way that they, the world, may see our good works and glorify him, which is in heaven. But the opposite of that is true as well. If they see our evil deeds or wrong deeds, they're not going to glorify him. They're going to say, well, if that's the God you serve, I don't want anything to do with him. And so he wanted them to change. He wanted this to in certain ways hurt them, that they would change. Not to the point where they would throw their hands up and say, well, then, forget it. But he wanted them to change because they saw what it was actually doing. Is there not a wise man among you? Is there not someone that's wise naturally, or one who is wise supernaturally? To me, that's a rhetorical question. There were people there like that. There were all 9 spiritual gifts were present here at Corinth. Somebody had the spiritual gift of knowledge and wisdom, and yet weren't willing to use it, or the people who were going to court weren't willing to go to that person to do that. Anyone among you high-minded folks are able to judge any of these disputes? Well, of course there were, but they weren't willing to go through the proper channels. The Corinthians proved here their lack of actual wisdom here by going to heathen courts. Again, Paul is not condemning the use of the law. He used the law. He used the idea of his Roman citizenship to get out of being beaten without a fair trial, or to go to Caesar to have his case here. It's not the idea of using the court system. It's why I'm doing that and how I go about that. Can I still be a Christian and show the world what Christ is like and do this? If I can't, if there's not a way to do that, maybe that the problem there is what I'm wanting. And we'll look a little bit more at that in a moment. We must, we mentioned this at the end of chapter 5. We must protect the image of what the church is. I am a reflection of Jesus. I'm a reflection of what the church is. And when I go to work or school or I go to, on vacation, I might come into contact with someone who has never known what the church is, never known who Jesus is, in a certain way of speaking. And when I act in a certain way or behave in a certain way that is different than what Jesus is, they're not going to assume that I'm not that. What they're going to assume is that's how he is. I'm a Christian, I'm Christ-like. And then when I don't act Christ-like, the world can't really tell the difference there. And they think, well, that's what Christians do. That's what preachers do, or whatever it is, that there are so many get caught up in all of these different problems and these things. Many of it is they bring it on themselves. And when people hear that, you're that, well, they say, well, that's what they assume you are. We must protect the image of the church and who God's people are, ultimately of Jesus. We can turn people off by our actions, by our speech, behavior, that kind of thing. And we need to be careful as Christians about going to court anytime. Let's bring it into our idea today. If someone asks, is it wrong to use the court? No, if someone steals something from me, I'm going to file a police report. We're going to try to get those things back. Not wrong to do that. The idea here is what is this going to look like? We should always be asking that. How is what I'm doing going to look like to those who don't know any better? If I'm someone who's very litigious and I want to take people to court and sue for the smallest things, what's that going to look like to the world compared to someone who's just doing what most people would find to be very reasonable? Will my action in the court or not, will it slander or defame the church? Is it going to do something that's going to bring shame on the cause of Christ or turn people off to the gospel? Because listen, that's our ultimate goal. My ultimate goal is not to get $50 from you that I feel like I'm owed. My ultimate goal is to be a light and preach the gospel in the way that I can in the place in the world where I am. That's my goal. Let's go to heaven. Let's get as many people as we can to go there. And if what I'm doing takes away from that, maybe I need to back off of what I'm actually doing. Jesus said there in Matthew 5, talked about the second mile. It was legal. It was absolutely legal that a Roman soldier and others as well could force someone to carry his pack a mile, 1,000 steps. And at the end of that mile, you had the legal right to drop that pack. Jesus said, well, this is what you're forced to do, but you need to be someone who's willing to go another mile. Keep going. Walk 2,000 steps with him before you give that pack back to him. You don't have to do that, and yet you're willing to do it. Why? Because that's easier? Far from it. But because that's what Jesus would do and did. Okay? And so I'm a reflection of what he would do. Not what the world is doing or would do, but what he would do and has done. And so, I think that question would help us as well. Before I would do any kind of action of a public sense, especially something he's using the idea of the courts here. Before I did anything in that direction, I would answer that question. Is this the second mile Christian? Again, someone takes something from me, I'm going to file a police report. We're going to try to get that back. That's not a second mile issue here. He's dealing with the civil issues. Is this really something that's going to reflect the right way on the church, on Jesus? And is this something that makes me a second mile Christian? And certainly it's left up to individuals in many cases to answer that. But the church at Corinth was not answering that one the right way. Because they were wanting their rights. They were wanting what the law was promised them. And they were willing to do anything to get it, including, it seems like, defaming one another in order to win this, whatever this case is. Question there, verse 5, or comments. Verse 6 as well, we read verses 5 and 6, but it was bad that they were having these disputes. Again, the church of Corinth was divided, not just along religious lines, but it seems like even social and civil lines. And so it was bad that they were having these disputes at all. If you and I are both acting like Jesus, we would not be divided. We would not have these kind of disputes. But they were making it worse. They were exacerbating the situation by taking it outside the church. Again, I used the example last time that we were together. If you and I have a dispute and I go to Facebook or I go to some other social media site and I tell everybody about what you've done to me, it's bad enough that you and I were having a dispute that I thought warranted that. But I've made it worse now by telling everybody about it. What should happen is we should, if we have a dispute, fix it then and then move on. And no one knows any difference. And certainly they were taking it in front of everybody. David Lipscomb on this verse in his commentary said, a man who is wishing to be satisfied legally and can't find a Christian, can't find a brother in the church to settle the matter, wants too much. And perhaps that was the problem. They didn't like the way that the wise person was offering to fix the problem. And so we're going to go to the courts because I think I deserve more and I'm owed more. And so he said, if you can't find a Christian, someone who's acting like Jesus, who can solve a problem between you and someone else, it might be that you're wanting too much. And perhaps that was what was happening here. And so I would certainly look very carefully before going into a situation like he's talking about here. But certainly he's not saying we can't use the legal system. We have a decent legal system, has its problems. But it's not that we shouldn't be involved in it. It's that I should be careful in how my action looks. I should be always aware of what I'm doing and saying and how others might perceive it. And that's not just in the legal system. That's in the things that I say, places that I go, that kind of thing. Verse 6. Anybody else? Verses 5 and 6. All right, verse 7. Now therefore, there is utterly a fault among you, because you go to law one with another. Why do you not rather take the wrong? Why do you not rather suffer yourselves to be defrauded? Here Paul introduces an idea to them that to many of them was foreign. Instead of going for what's owed you, why don't you rather be wronged? He's talking here to the person who is legally owed something. It's not the person who is trying to get it by some nefarious means, or he's trying to get it through some kind of gotcha or something like that. He's talking to the person who has actually been defrauded, who is trying to get something that in essence was legally taken from him. Again, this is some kind of civil matter here. And he said, what would be better for you to do as far as how it looks to other people, take the wrong. Be someone who is defrauded. Be someone who someone has taken from, and don't seek vengeance. Again, I'm being like Jesus. And here in this case anyway, what he's telling them is in certain cases it would be better just to be wronged and be someone who is not vengeful than to be getting everything that's owed me by the legal system. Jesus was wronged. The legal system in many ways failed him. The fact that his trial was done at night, that one of his own people were used against him as a witness against him. So many other things. The laws that he had broken or they claimed to be broken they weren't punishable by death. All of these other things, he was wronged entirely. And I realized that was part of the plan. But if anybody had a case of the legal system failing him and needing to deserve what's his, it was Jesus. What could Jesus legally have done? Call 10,000 angels, the song says. He legally could have done that. And everybody would have said, yes, I would have done that too. But instead, he allowed himself to be wronged, allowed himself to be defrauded, if we're using Paul's words here. So he's asking them the question, why not rather do that? Why did that not come across your mind? This is utterly a fault, he says. He uses the word that means wholly a defeat because of their attitude. This was the problem. Again, it wasn't necessarily what they were doing. It was why and how. Love had failed them. Colossians 3, verse 13, let's read that before we go any further there. Colossians 3 and verse 13. They were to, as Paul told the people at Colossae, forbear one another, forgive one another. If any man has a quarrel against any, even as Jesus forgave you, so also do yourselves. They had failed this. If you have a quarrel one with another, be willing to forgive. They were not willing to forgive, even those who weren't asking forgiveness. Jesus was willing to forgive even those who hadn't sought forgiveness. And so he wants them here to understand, if you have a quarrel against someone, have a forgiving attitude at the beginning, and then we can deal with the issue as it continues on. They didn't have love one for another. And Paul's ultimately going to get to 1 Corinthians 13, where love is supposed to cover up all of those things that they had been doing. If they had love, if they were unified, then all that stuff in between would have certainly gone away, if not been much better. It's better, Paul's idea here is it's better to undergo a wrong than to gain victory at the expense of love and forgiveness for a brother. I don't always have to have my way. I don't always have to have my rights. And just because my rights have been violated doesn't mean that I have to, make a big show of it. We're certainly owed certain things by our legal system, but it is not the legal system that's going to save me. It is not the way of salvation. And so putting too much emphasis on that was one of their problems, and he spoke to that there. Verse 7. I'll go back there for anybody else. Verse 7. Yeah, go ahead. It's a good question. Certainly, in looking at what we noticed last time, there are several different kinds of courts. This seems to be civil matter. But because it uses the word defraud there and has the idea of losing something, could this not also apply to a criminal case? For example, if someone stole something from me. And I can't say that that's not the case. Again, even if something like that happened to me, while I would go through certain legal channels, I would still make sure that I'm doing things the way that Jesus would have done them. If someone takes something from me, I'll try to get that back, but I'm not going to then turn around and sue them for 100 times more than what they took from me, just to teach them a lesson kind of thing. I don't, if someone wants to apply this to civil and criminal, I don't think that I could argue against that, because he uses the idea of being defrauded, having something taken from us. Is what I'm doing a reflection of what Jesus is? And if not, I need to find a way to do that. Can even the person who defrauded me here, can I find a way to convert that person by doing what I'm doing in return? Am I wanting vengeance? Am I wanting to teach the person a lesson? Or am I going the second mile, and am I turning the other cheek that's there? I mean, again, it's walking a line here. We're certainly not those who are to allow ourselves to be taken advantage of and just someone, whatever you want, come and take it, that kind of thing. But on the other hand, we should be careful that we're not those who are out being vigilantes, teaching everybody a lesson, that kind of thing. So could this have to do with the criminal parts of it? Sure, yeah. When someone criminalized me, we go back to the case I mentioned earlier, the Winkler case there. If you'll remember, Dan and his wife, Cindy, were very forgiving and loving during that time. I've just had a lot of respect for them, how they handled that situation. Grief-stricken, awful, awful situation, regardless of what actually happened. And yet they were those who were very graceful during that situation. Heard him preach a sermon at a lectureship not long after that happened on love and forgiveness, and it was incredible. But that kind of notion there. Can I, even in that situation, show others what Jesus is like? That's the overall principle here, and that's not what they were doing. So civil, criminal, other things as well, we must be like Jesus. And how do I do that? That's a case-by-case situation, but it's something that we have to answer for, and it's definitely something that the Corinthians weren't doing. So sure, yeah, absolutely, I think it could be. Yes, sir.
Or brother against brother, brother against non-brother, right?
Yeah, that's a good point as well. Keep in mind the context here is two Christians that are doing this, and that's certainly the specific context. But when am I not supposed to be like Jesus? When I'm with my brethren, I'm supposed to be like Jesus, and when I go into the world and I'm the only Christian within 100 miles, I'm supposed to be like Jesus. So sure, the immediate context is two Christians, but certainly the overall context, I'm supposed to be like him, and no matter what happens to me. good, a little bit bad, or really bad. That's the idea there. So sure, yeah, I appreciate you mentioning that. Anybody else? Verse 7. All right, verse 8. No, he says. He asked them the question. And why not rather be wronged or defrauded? No, he said, you do wrong and defraud, and that to your brethren. So not only are you trying not to be wronged and defrauded, because that's against my rights or whatever, what have you. But that would be bad enough. If you were doing that to people in the world, that would be bad. He said, but not only that, but you're also doing it to your brethren. We talked about Abraham and Lot last time, how that they divided the land there, and Abraham, against the legal system, allowed Lot to choose which plot of land he wanted. He, being the elder there, was legally allowed to choose the land. I get to choose. I'm older, so I'm going to. But he said he wanted Lot to. He said, we can't have this dispute because we are brethren. That's supposed to be our attitude as well. Even if I'm legally owed something, is it something that I must have? Or am I putting too much emphasis on it? Better to suffer wrong than to do wrong. They were robbing and wronging their own brethren. And while that first half is bad enough, they were doing it to people that were of the church. And then on top of that, they were doing it in front of the world. And so it was snowballing in many ways here. Understand that doing wrong sends me to hell. Doing what's wrong, I'm condemned for that. But when I am wronged, allowing myself to be wronged, that doesn't, okay? Doing what's wrong is bad. Allowing myself to be wronged is not bad. And too many times we want to see ourselves through how the world sees us, and we want to be, those, no one's going to take advantage of me, and this is my right, and this is what the law says. And many times we forget that our legal system is not the ultimate one. Our judicial system is not the ultimate one. The law we live under in this country, it's not the greatest. America is not God's people. The church is. And so I need to understand that his law, that's what's most important. And if I can follow both, great. But if I have to choose, I'm going to allow myself to be wrong if it ultimately glorifies Jesus. And so that's the idea. The Christians evidently did not think of themselves as set apart and sanctified and holy, because they were acting just like the world, whether it be with stuff with immorality in chapter 5 or in the court system here in chapter 6 and other things that we'll mention later. So they were certainly didn't think of themselves as set apart and sanctified, whatever was happening there. That was not how they were handling it properly. Verse 8, anybody?
The difficulty is that in this case, you're talking about brother against brother, and so just by definition, if you've been wrong, or if somebody's wrong here, somebody is acting, one of the brethren is acting in an unchristlike way. And so someone has to take the higher road. I think most of our kids, us and disputes, and normally they're both involved, but sometimes maybe it's just one of them involved, but in order for there to be peace, sometimes one of them has to just take the higher road and allow themselves to maybe, have their right to not have their brother or sister next to them violate. And so somebody's doing wrong, and the other one has to accept their wrong. And I guess that's what makes it difficult. But the sad thing is that I don't know of many cases where I actually sit in practice, when have we ever seen a case where somebody's going for divorce and the elders sit down with that couple and work out their dispute? We've never seen that happen. When have we ever seen a case like that? And again, the difficulty is by this point, somebody or both are acting in an unchristlike way. And so to get them to agree to sit down with the brethren and work it out is very, very difficult.
You bring up a really good illustration, and one that I try to use, you can probably use in every chapter in this book, and that is your children. The church at Corinth was not mature. They were acting like children in every sense of the word. And they were immature in how they handled disputes and how they wanted things handled, that sort of thing. And so certainly, if you've had children and you've had to be the judge in a lot of those cases, you realize that someone's always out seeking justice. And they've always been wronged, and they've never done anything wrong in order to quote unquote, deserve what's happened. And that's how they were. These were brethren, they were family members, they were children of God, and yet they were acting like children, not the mature people that Paul wants them to. At the end of this book, he's going to remind them to act like men, act like adults, but they weren't doing that. And so, yeah, that's a great illustration, and certainly the case here. These were two people who, just like in chapter 5, where one of them was living in sin and everybody was doing nothing about it, we have at least one person in this relationship who is living in sin, wanting something that they shouldn't have or defrauding someone else, and no one's doing anything to stop it. Either they haven't offered or it's not been accepted, and they've gone to the world to fix these disputes. And so again, it's not necessarily what they were doing, using the legal system. It's how and it's why. Why am I doing that? How am I going about it? Is it the right way, or is there a different way? Is there a better way? Is there a way that I can follow both God's law and the law of the land? And yeah, certainly. Yeah, I like that. Children, definitely, absolutely. I have to stop myself from giving you all the examples of my children and how it fits with some of these things from time to time. Anything else there? Very quickly, for good or bad, for fortunately or unfortunately, we have a great, though we might doubt it from time to time, legal system and government system in this country, based on principles that have been around for many, many centuries. And sometimes we like to listen to those in our country with the idea that is the ultimate, that we are citizens of this country and this law protects me from this or that. And we talk about rights and we talk about constitutions and amendments and all of those things. Great things. I studied political science in school. I enjoy that. But I have to keep in mind that just as the song says, this world is not our home. We are not citizens of this country, though we claim it in a certain way of speaking. Ultimately, this is not my home. This country is not where I pledge my allegiance in the ultimate sense. We are citizens of a different country, one that we even haven't been to yet, but we're going there. And that law supersedes this law that we have in this country. And those rights that we have there in that country supersede the rights that we have in this country. And I need to keep that in mind. The law of this land says you have rights. Here's a constitution. Here's a Bill of Rights. All of these things you are guaranteed because you are a citizen of this country. The law of God, rather, Jesus' law, says whether you have rights or not, give them up if they'll help somebody else. If it will be a light in this world, forget about your rights. John 13:34 and other places, Jesus said that greater love has no man that lay down his life for his friends. Well, he didn't have to do that. It was his right, to stay where he was in heaven. But he emptied himself. He emptied himself of his rights in order for you and for me to have citizenship in that country. Had Jesus had the idea that many today do about their rights, none of us would have any hope of salvation. And so be more like him. I realize his was a different mission than ours. And I can't do what he did for the same reason he did. But I can still be a small light, a reflection of what he was in the lives of someone else. And while I do have rights that are guaranteed and can use them to the benefit of others and myself, if it comes to a point where I have to choose between that country that I'm headed to and this one that I'm a member of, I better choose the former and be like that one more than this one. The U.S. law, this country's law says, though it doesn't always practice it, you shouldn't be wronged. You should not be defrauded or this and that. Christ's law says it's better to suffer wrong, allow yourself to be wrong, than to be the one who's doing the wronging. And so again, while it is similar in nature, and I think there are certain principles upon which it is based, God's law is ultimately the one that we're going to be judged by. That's where our citizenship is, and it is overall and in every way better. And so, yes, we should be proud of our country or what have you. We are citizens. We should take part in the legal system. If you want to, you should vote, that sort of thing. But America has not, and it's never been God's people. The church is God's people. And so we should be different. There should be a line of delineation. There should be a distinction. And unfortunately, then and now, people kind of blur that line. And you can't tell the difference between a Christian and someone who's not. even though both of them may be American citizens. Anything there, he's going to go on to, it's related, but anything else there through verse 8. Do you not know, verse 9, know you not, that the unrighteous shall not inherit the kingdom of God? Don't be deceived, neither fornicators, idolaters, adulterers, effeminate, abusers of themselves with mankind. He's going to continue on in verse 10 to say, none of these shall inherit the kingdom of God. Notice how he's gone from the court system of verse 8 to unrighteous acts or people living in sin in verse 9. When I act like the world in one way, when I'm wrong in one way, I'm lumped in with the rest of it. You know, we like those small sins that we commit. We don't appreciate the big ones that everybody else does. Being wrong, living in sin, doing wrong is just as bad as doing any of the other things that we would consider wrong. So don't be deceived. They were deceiving themselves. They were tricking themselves into thinking that in this way, in the court system, I can defraud someone. And it's not as bad as idolatry or fornication or some of these other things. Paul said, don't deceive yourself. None of these things are going to get anyone into heaven. Very common in the world, but it's not common with the people who are going to that country. In fact, it doesn't exist in them. And so the idea there is plain. Let's finish verse 10 there. Abusers of themselves of mankind, nor thieves, nor covetous, nor drunkards, revilers, extortioners. There's our court case that we were talking about. None of these shall inherit the kingdom of God. All of those things and more. This is not an exhaustive list, but all of those will keep me out of heaven. And they were putting themselves right there with the rest of them. And if I want to tell myself that what I'm doing is justified because of my intentions, and yet I look at other people based on their actions and I say, that's not going to fly, I'm deceiving myself. If I'm like the world, I'm going to be where the world ultimately is. And so he wants them to be very careful in their actions. So this list here, he's getting into slightly different section on how we respond to things in this world. And with 5 minutes left, I hesitate to go forward. But let's look at a couple of things here, verses 9 and 10. As with the court cases up through verse 8, Paul is encouraging them beginning here to stay out of the circle of sin. 1 John 3, verse 9, let's read that together. Stay out of the circle of sin. Don't be associated with those things that are of this world. 1 John 3, verse 9, whosoever is born of God does not commit sin, for his seed remains in him. He cannot sin because he is born of God. Does that mean that it's impossible for us to sin? Obviously not. But the one who is living the way that God's people do, the one who is born of God, is not someone who is going to be habitually living in sin. That takes me out of God there when I'm living in sin. Stay out of that realm of sin. We make mistakes. We say things we shouldn't. We do things from time to time that if we thought more clearly, we wouldn't do. But to be someone who is just like the world constantly is not a mark of God's people. The prince of this world, he reigns over the world, sin, according to the idea of sin. I shouldn't be living in that kingdom because that one is doomed from the beginning. This here, verses 9 and 10 is someone has called it a solemn roll call of the condemned. He's going to tell them in the next verse, some of you were just like this. You're no longer like that. We'll talk more about that next time that we're together. But notice some of those that he calls out here, uses the word idolaters and covetous, uses both of those together. Idolaters there, Colossians 3 and verse 5, those who desire and want and put everything else under what they want. That's an idolater there. Effeminate, the word the King James uses there, that's from the Greek word that means soft touch, or those who are addicted to the sins of the flesh, this world, and the things that are there. 1 John 2, verses 15 through 17 tells us the things of this world are passing away. They're deteriorating. And the one who is constantly after the things of this world, that is certainly someone who is chasing the wind, striving after the wind there. Several of these, we could throw in these court cases into the words that he's using. The one who is looking for defrauding someone else is in a way an idolater. He's also someone who, according to this definition, is effeminate, someone who is after the things of this world. Now, abusers of themselves of mankind, that regardless of what many want to try to change that definition today, the Greek word there means the homosexual. That's the idea that's there. And there's also the covetous, the unlawful desire, which is a form of idolatry. Again, some of these, you can look at why he's connecting them there to the court cases. That's our time there. Thank you so much. Appreciate your attention. I'll put this back up next time we're together. We'll start here in verses 9 and 10. Thank you so much.